Hey, what's going on? I'm Shep, and we're back at Iron Anchor Cycles with another installment in our FXR build series. So if you've been following along, in the last video I think I mentioned that the next video was going to be doing the wiring harness in the bike, and in fact I might have lied a little bit on that. There were a couple of other things we wanted to button up and some parts we were waiting on, and frankly I'm just procrastinating doing the wiring just a little bit while we wait for some other things. So in the meantime, decided to tackle a couple of small but related jobs that needed to be done on this bike, and I figured this would be a perfect opportunity for a video to talk about something that I think is probably pretty relevant to most people with really any kind of Harley, and that has to do with the stability and vibrations in the bike. And this could be anything from Dyna death wobble to really any kind of wobble or anything like that that you're getting in the bike. Now, there's a million different opinions out there on what causes these various wobbles and what products you can buy to eliminate them, be that some kind of a add-on stabilizer or upgraded mounts. And there's literally probably hundreds of differences of opinions and things that you can do. I'm not going to say necessarily that there's a right way or a wrong way in terms of all that, but what I will say is I'll give you my piece of advice when it comes to that stuff. My suggestion is always, and that's what we're going to do on our bike here, is address things that are not working properly or may not be working properly before you decide there's something functionally wrong with the bike that you need to add parts to correct. So let me clarify that a little bit. That's to say that a wobble, whether you feel it in the front or the back, can really come from anywhere on the bike. There's lots of interconnected parts on your bike. Little things like the way that the rubber mount on these motors are, and this would apply to a bagger, a Dyna, an FXR, really anything that's got a rubber mounted motor. Basically, you know, if you were watching when we did our swing arm video, the transmission, which is obviously hard bolted to the motor, is isolated from your frame by these big rubber isolators. However, it's not really isolated from your swing arm. So what does that mean? It means that vibration from the motor can transmit into the rear wheel pretty easily. So you may spend a lot of time looking for some problem in the rear end of the bike when in fact there isn't a problem in the rear end of the bike. You've got an issue more towards the front. Same applies when we talk about the front. I mean, I think this is probably where most people feel like they've got an issue and they want to start adding steering dampeners and fork braces and all kinds of stuff. And I'm not going to say that that stuff doesn't have a place and doesn't have an effect, but there are a lot of other things that you should be looking at, which are things that are on the bike that may need to be looked at, serviced, or replaced. Anything from wheel bearings is a really common one. Tire pressure is something. You have bearings in your neck, whether they need to be greased, replaced, or the adjustment is not correct in terms of the preload that's put on them. So those are a whole bunch of things that are all very inexpensive parts that really you should look at and confirm before you start buying a whole bunch of stuff. Now, in the case of our bike, we're not talking about the front end itself right now, and obviously we've done what we're going to do in the back, but there are a couple of other things that I want to address here, and the first one is talking about the stabilizers on the motor. Now, depending on your bike, you may have one, you may have two, you know, if you've got a rigid mounted motor, maybe zero. Whatever the case is, your Dynas are typically going to have one. Your baggers, depending on the bike, could be one. I think there are some with two, and an FXR has two. So you're going to have one at the bottom in the front of the motor, and you're going to have one at the top in the middle of the motor. Now, I already went ahead and replaced the one at the top, and I did that ahead of time because I wanted to show you what came off. So this is, the stabilizers are the same front and rear, or front and top, I should say, and basically, there's not much to it. There are upgraded versions of this that you can buy, and we've used them and they're great. Comp Cams makes a really cool upgraded stabilizer that I'll include a link to that in the description in this video in case you want to check it out. They're fairly expensive as compared to just an OE replacement. Now, not knowing anything about this bike, we're not necessarily trying to make an upgrade here because these, when they're working properly, really do work fine. If you're looking for that additional upgrade, and we've used it on Dynas a bunch, and it really does help with some of the motor vibration, basically where this is just a solid steel piece with a Heim joint with a bushing in it, those upgraded ones essentially have fluid and a plunger that dampens some of that vibration a little bit. In any event, though, there was really no reason to replace these unless there was something wrong with them. And in the case of ours, and it's going to be very hard for the camera to pick this up, but there's play and there's looseness in these joints. And when it was on the bike, you could hear it going tick, 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 tick when you turn it back and forth. And the lower one is the same. So not totally surprising that these being 30 years old would get worn out. You know, that's just an age and weathering kind of situation. And so given what we're doing here, we want to replace them with ones that work properly. So we got OE replacements from Drag, and they're not expensive for just the regular replacements, so a super easy thing to do. The other thing that we're going to address at the same time as we do the lower is we're going to look at our front motor mount, which is down here. Now, obviously, in the rear, we replaced these rubber isolator blocks when we did the swing arm. And now down here, this is a really good opportunity to replace this one. Now, all we've done down here so far, and I'll zoom in when we kind of get to working down here, but you've got your voltage regulator, and that's actually sitting right here. That just is, its bracket is just held on with 2 bolts. You just take them out and this voltage regulator comes off. Our wiring is disconnected, so we were able to take the whole thing off the bike. If your wiring is still connected, you can just let it hang out of the way. So what that exposed here was a whole bunch of bolts, some of which are the motor mount itself, some of which are the motor mount to the frame, to the motor, and then obviously the bolt for the stabilizer link as well. So it's kind of muddy and gunky and whatever down there, and that does give you some understanding of some of the abuse that this front motor mount takes. Oil changes, getting oil on that bushing, everything coming up off the road, just, you know, crashing into it. It's an old rubber piece, and frankly, there's really not a whole lot of reason if you're here and you're doing all this not to just go ahead and replace it. If you sort of inspect yours and you see that it's got any kind of issues, it's worth replacing. In our case, we are going to do an upgrade on this one. We got a front motor mount from Alloy Art with one of their poly bushings similar to like a good and tight handlebar bushing. We've had great experience with it. It's a nice piece, and so we're going to go ahead and do that. What we're not going to do, and for the moment anyway, we may go back and, you know, who knows, add it on later, is there is a replacement for the motor mount adapter that goes from the motor onto the motor mount. You can get a billet aluminum one of those. In our case, the steel one is I think going to be fine, so we're just going to leave it alone. If something changes in that situation or we feel like we need to make a change, we'll do that. But for now, what we're trying to do is just, like I said from the very beginning, replace everything with parts that are going to do something functionally and make this bike better, and changing that out for a billet piece isn't really necessary at this point. So we'll zoom the camera into the work area. I'll show you how to kind of do these stabilizer links, the motor mount, and hopefully this will be informative for you and you get to see a little bit of progress on this bike. So stick around and we'll be right back. All right, so we are set up and ready to start working on this, and with now that you can see it a little bit better with the camera zoomed in, I can kind of talk about what we're going to replace. So obviously the stabilizer link is here, and this is going to obviously come off pretty easily. Adjust the new one to the same length, put it back on. We're also going to replace this rubber mount that is sort of sandwiched around the frame cross member, and so this is a rubber piece that has probably seen better days, so we're going to go ahead and replace that. The piece I mentioned here, this motor mount adapter plate, this triangle piece, this we're going to keep and we're going to reuse. Just didn't feel like it was necessary or prudent to replace it at this point, so we're going to go ahead and reuse it. Now, we're doing 2 different things at the same time, so you just want to be mindful of making sure that you understand the full job and what's needed to do before you get yourself into trouble. Now, I mentioned that in this case because obviously when you're replacing this motor mount, there's some play in it, and you want to make sure that you get the motor back in the same position that it started, assuming it was in the correct position to begin with. And basically, the stabilizer link as adjusted is going to be your guide to do that. So the first step in this is to take the stabilizer link off, and if you just kind of went ahead and said, all right, we're going to set the new one to the same length as this and put it back on, you might not get it exactly right. And if it didn't exactly line up and the motor was not connected, you'd sort of push the motor into a place it wasn't meant to be to line up with your incorrectly adjusted stabilizer. So you really want to do these things one thing at a time so that you always have a reference point, or sort of true north, if you will, of where the motor is supposed to be. So in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to leave the motor as it is, and we're going to go ahead and take this stabilizer link off, and then go ahead and try and put the new one on and make sure it goes on perfectly. And then we'll use that at the very end to put it all back together, but maintaining this original link just in case it doesn't work exactly right, we'll have something to compare to. So like I said, first step's gonna be to take this off. So we'll just go ahead with a 9/16 wrench and do that. Right, you want to be mindful of any spacers that are in there, and remember to put them back in the same order so that, like I said, everything is aligned properly. Hopefully now you can see all the play that exists in this. Obviously, I mean, these are Heim joints. They're meant to turn a little bit, but the bushings that are in here are just totally worn out, just rattling around. So these are definitely time for them to go. So we got a lock washer on that side and no spacer. So I'll try and hold this up a little more. I mean, hopefully this is apparent. You can see where it's all sort of worn away and kind of crusty there. And this is just, I mean, completely sloppy. So this is trash for sure. So from here, let me grab the other stabilizer link. We'll take it out of the package. So these do come with 2 new chrome bolts, which I'm not going to use because they look kind of nasty to me. If we've got the correct size ARP hardware for some of this stuff, we'll use it. But if not, just a quick hit of the original hardware on the wire wheel and they look fine. So here's your new link compared to the old one. So basically what I'm going to do now is just set this to the correct length, put it in place, and tighten it down. One side of this is right-handed thread, one side is left-handed thread, so you can sort of turn this nut in the middle and it will expand and contract. So basically what we got to do there is just start by using the original one as a guide and paying attention to the way the Heim joint ends are aligned. In this case, one's tilted in just a little bit to line up properly with the angles of where it bolts to. So we're just going to attempt to make this the same length and also keeping those holes aligned as they should be. So I'm sorry this is not super visible. I don't think you can see it. I'm just using one as a comparison to the other to get them close to where they need to be. And then I'm going to come back up here and then taking the original spacer, and we'll clean these up before we do the final install, and our bolt. And I'm going to put this in. Just finger tight. And now, sort of get a sense of where you're at, and this obviously needs to come out a little bit. And you can use the bolt sort of as a guide to tell you if you're there or not. If it fits through and threads in, that's a good sign. If it doesn't, that's a bad sign. Okay, so just taking one side and then the other off and confirming that we're lined up and that the bolts go in and thread in easily, we can tell that we are where we need to be with the adjustment on this link. So now you've got jam nuts that need to be tightened on each of these. Now, fortunately in this particular case, it's very easy to do this by holding the ends and tightening it with it in place on the bike, that helps to keep the length and rotation where you need it to be. In some cases, like maybe like a shifter linkage or something like that, you really need to do it off the bike, so you might have to do a little trial and error of as you tighten it, making sure it doesn't come out of alignment. The other thing worth pointing out here is, obviously, as you can see, we used the existing geometry of the motor to confirm that the length was correct. If we had gone and taken the motor mount out and put it back in, we would have lost that reference point, and the only thing we would have had to use as a reference was the old link, which can be done, but also you don't have a way to confirm that it's correct by placing it back onto the motor. So that's just a little tip from me. Let me grab another wrench, and then we'll just go ahead and tighten these down. Okay, that's one. And all right, so with those in place, just want to confirm this one more time. Okay, just do one more kind of on and off of this just to make sure that it's still nice and straight, and that by tightening it we didn't loosen anything up. So I'm just going to loosen both of these. And so what we should have is that this should be able to move just a little bit, assuming that our lengths are all right. So this side threads in and out nicely. It doesn't look like there's any binding or anything like that. And this side turns nicely as well. So I don't think we have any issues, and we can go ahead and proceed to our next step. So like I said, that should just want to go right back into place there. These threads are just a little dirty, which is probably why it's not threading in super easy, but it's definitely lined up, so we're good with that stabilizer. Now, when you take this off, it's not a bad idea to maintain the orientation of everything so that you know which way is which. So part of what we'll do with that is we'll leave the hardware kind of in place so it'll have a reference of how it goes back on. Okay, so from here, probably have a little more cleaning to do as we keep taking layers off. We just find more and more dirt. But the next thing that we're going to do here with that link out of the way is go ahead and get the motor mount disconnected and then jack the motor up just a little bit to be able to get the mount plate out of the cross member. Okay, so our step from here is going to be to go ahead and get the motor mount removed. That's going to be done by undoing our bolt and washers from the motor mount itself, and then getting the 2 bolts that hold the motor mount to the cross member out. And then obviously we'll need to lift the motor a little bit in order to get the pressure off of the mount to be able to get it out. That is done by just using a little piece of a 2x4 underneath the motor on a jack to lift the motor up out of the frame a little bit. Obviously, you don't have to go crazy, and just keep in mind up at the top that you don't have any issues when you're moving the motor around like that. You don't want to scratch or damage anything. So we'll go ahead and start by getting that center mount bolt out of the way. So there's our nut, large washer, and then the bolt, the top washer will just come out. You can see I was pretty grungy under there. So you just need a little bit of muscle to get it off, but not a huge deal. All right, so the next thing is gonna be, we've got the bolts and nuts on the motor mount itself that we need to loosen up. All right, so now with our hardware out of the way, we can go ahead and lift the motor slightly and pull the mount out, hopefully. Okay, so as you can see, we've got the motor lifted. There is some gap here. However, there's not quite enough room to get this out. And unfortunately, this is as high as we can lift this particular motor in this bike. The limiting factor is there is one of the Allen head screws. You're not going to be able to see it. Sorry, I'm pointing. You can't see. One of the Allen head screws on the rocker box cover is contacting the frame, the backbone. So short of taking the rockers off and getting some clearance, this is as high as it's going to go. So not the end of the world. Things don't always go exactly as you want them to. All it means is we're just going to go ahead and just take this motor mount plate off, and then we'll have all the room that we need. So I'm going to grab a couple of wrenches, we'll take that off, and then we'll keep going. All right. Not without a fair bit of grime, but there's our plate. We got it off. I'm just gonna go bring this over to the parts washer and clean it, and we'll just get back to doing that install. All right, so we've got our old motor mount out. You can see that probably looks a little worse for wear. And we've got our cross member cleaned up and ready to drop the new motor mount in. This is the motor mount from Alley-Art. I don't think I showed you that yet. So nice billet aluminum carrier, definitely a little lighter than what comes coming out of there. Aluminum spacer washer insert and new hardware. So that is going to drop into that hole right there. And obviously you can see this is what we were talking about. There's quite a bit of opportunity to move this in order to want to keep everything straight and aligned. So the next thing I'm going to do is just put the top plate back on. And then we'll be back on track in terms of sort of the normal procedure for the installation of this. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that now, and then we'll continue. All right, so with our motor mount plate back in place and centered in the same place it was, and just to make sure, I didn't do this on camera just because we were just putting this bolt back on and tightening these bolts down, but obviously there's a little play in this just to make sure that we got it in the right position. We just used our stabilizer link as a guide to make sure that these two holes still line up with one another as they should. So they still do, we're good there. Our next step is we've still got the motor raised up. We're going to, these bolts here are just, there's no nuts on them yet. They're just sort of hiding in place there. We've got some fine thread nylock nuts that come with the Alley-Art kit. We're gonna go ahead and put these on loosely. We're gonna get this centered up where it needs to be. That would basically be centered between on the cross member. And then we'll get these loosely installed, and then we'll start to get the fasteners put on. The stabilizer is gonna go back on before we get this put into place. So start by throwing these nuts on here. Okay. So now we're going to go ahead and put the stabilizer into position. Okay. And these do have lock washers on them, but I'm just going to throw a little bit of blue Loctite. A little bit of blue Loctite for good measure. Okay. So obviously what we want to make sure here is that these bolts are able to thread in properly and nice and straight, and they do. Okay, and I'm going to torque these to 30 pounds at this point. Hope you're going the right direction. Okay, there's one. And two. All right, so now what I'm going to do is bring the motor down so we're just above the top of our motor mount. So it can still move. And I'm going to center this up, and then we'll get these all tightened down in the right places. Okay, should be about centered there. Just make sure our bolt goes through properly. And that should do it. So now I'm just going to lower the motor down. And just recheck that gap. Feels good. All right, so now what we're going to do is tighten up the bolts here to 15 pounds. Right. Okay. All right. So we're looking good there. So our next step is going to be to torque this down. Just check the spec here. All right, so this one's going to go to 25 pounds. Before I throw this on, I'm just going to, actually we cleaned this already, so we're good to go. I am going to put a little bit of Loctite on here. Install that. Okay, so with all of that in place, that is going to complete the installation of the front motor mount and the new stabilizer. So obviously all that rickety play that existed in the old one of these is gone, and we've got a nice new polyurethane isolator that should hold the engine nice and secure. So the only thing left to do here is to put the voltage regulator bracket back on. We're going to leave it off for the moment, but hopefully this gives you a sense of what's involved in replacing some of these parts and why you might want to do it. And hopefully also that it's not always necessary to go right to buying a whole bunch of new parts to put on the bike, as opposed to checking and maybe replacing some of the ones that are already there. So that's going to do it for this installation in the video series. Stick around, and we'll be back with a couple new videos hopefully pretty soon.